They weren't gang leaders, war criminals, or hardened adults. They were just teenagers. Kids who should have been worried about prom, first jobs, or learning to drive. Instead, they were plotting something far darker. Acts of violence so shocking they would haunt entire communities and leave seasoned detectives shaken. These are the faces you might have passed in a school hallway, on a neighborhood sidewalk, or even sitting next to you in class, smiling, laughing, hiding secrets that no one could have imagined. But behind closed doors, something unthinkable was brewing, a mix of rage, obsession, and chilling calculation that would explode into murder. In this video, we're diving deep into the most dangerous teenage killers in U.S. history, cases that gripped the nation, shattered families, and forced us to confront one chilling truth. Sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones you'd least suspect. By the time you hear their stories, you may never look at a normal teenager the same way again. Case 1.
Charlie Starkweather wrought a trail of cold-blooded murder across the West, the likes of which America had never known. 31 years later, his so-called accomplice, Betrayal and Fugate, still maintains her innocence. She was released in 1976 after 18 years of a life sentence.
Charles Starkweather and Betrayal and Fugate. In the frozen stillness of mid-January 1958, a tense investigation began in the plains of Nebraska and Wyoming. Charles Starkweather, a 19-year-old high school dropout with a simmering resentment and adoptive James Dean rebellion in his posture, embarked on a deadly trajectory. His girlfriend, Betrayal and Fugate, just 14, found herself entangled in a case that would become a notorious study in psychological profile and criminal justice complexity. The spree ignited with the brutal slaying of Betrayal's stepfather, mother, and toddler half-sister in her home. Starkweather claims she walked into the scene having been told her family was held hostage, that compliance would protect them. Betrayal insists she was trapped. The court determined otherwise, noting she had opportunities to flee, but stayed. The court's refusal to see her as a hostage turned her trial into a contested psychological portrait. Over the following days, the couple killed strangers of varied ages and social standings. Farmers, a teenage pair, a wealthy industrialist, his wife and maid, and a traveling salesman across state lines. The randomness of the victims intensified public panic, casting the crime spree as emblematic of youth gone lethal and stirring national attention on America's fears of juvenile delinquency. Law enforcement response became part of the drama. Block-by-block searches in Lincoln, local vigilantes, governor-activated National Guard, and a tense car chase in Wyoming, leading to the dramatic arrest. Moments that held a nation's attention in real time. The legal proceedings that followed added layers to the psychological dissection. Starkweather's trial ran from May 5 to May 23, 1958. Fugate's followed from October 27 to November 21, 1958. He received a death sentence after a 22-hour jury deliberation, while she was sentenced to life, later commuted in part, her age no doubt affecting sentencing not requested as capital punishment. The courtroom became a stage for conflicting narratives. Starkweather testified that Fugate was a willing participant. She maintained she was coerced. Jurors, legal observers, and psychologists wrestled with her psychological profile. Teenage vulnerability, trauma, manipulation, moral panic, as well as the blurred line between accomplice and captive. In the sentencing hearing, the juxtaposition was stark. Starkweather facing the electric chair, executed June 25, 1959, declaring little remorse and reflecting on the only time he and Betrayal had more fun. Betrayal, released on parole in 1976 after 18 years, rebuilt a quiet life. In recent years, she sought pardon, saying the burden of being seen as willing has weighed heavily, but pardons boards have declined to revisit her case. Beyond the crime, this case raises vital public safety and systemic lessons. It underlines the importance of understanding adolescent psychology in legal contexts, the dangers of sensationalizing youth crime, and the value of clear protocols when minors face coercive threats. Law enforcement tactics, house-by-house searches, cross-state coordination, and National Guard support are enduring models in crisis response. The Courtroom highlighted how narrative and psychological framing can sway verdicts and sentencing. Today's legal system continues wrestling with coerced participation, age, and culpability dynamics. The story's legacy remains potent. It triggered cultural reflection, sparking films like Badlands and Murder in the Heartland, and today's docuseries like The 12th Victim continue to probe the psychological depth of Fugate's experience and the justice system's handling of it. True crime audiences stay captivated by this case not only for its shocking actions, but for the psychological mysteries, legal drama, and moral questions it still poses. At its core, the Starkweather Fugate story is a psychological case study wrapped in true crime drama about manipulation, age, rebellion, and justice. For public safety, it underscores early warning signs: youth alienation, access to weapons, troubled mentored relationships. For criminal justice, it spotlights investigative coordination and legal nuance when dealing with minors in violent crimes. It remains one of the most compelling investigations, psychological profiles, and legal proceedings of its era. Case 2.
No, you goddamn piece of punk-ass shit! Do not mess with that friggin' kid! If you do, I'll rip off your goddamn head and shove it so far up your friggin' ass, you'll be coughing up dandruff for 4 frickin' months!
Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. On April 20th, 1999, a meticulously plotted assault on Columbine High School in Colorado shattered the illusion of safety in American classrooms. Over nearly an hour, 2 seniors, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, killed 13 people and wounded many more before taking their own lives. Their motivations remain deeply complex, but the forensic psychological exploration sheds chilling light on how 2 troubled minds converged in tragedy. Eric Harris's psychological profile often fits the archetype of a calculating psychopath: manipulative, narcissistic, sadistic, harboring fantasies of torture and control. His writings and basement videos reveal a disturbing detachment. He meticulously recorded their preparations, rehearsing a masterpiece. In one rare, unnerving clip, he brandishes a shotgun he calls Arlene, describing their plan as better than previous shootings. Dylan Klebold presents a stark contrast: intensely depressed, self-loathing, spiritually conflicted, a sensitive but broken soul drawn into Harris's orbit. As some investigators and Klebold's own mother later reflected, Dylan's role was rooted in life indifference, a suicidal despair that sought escape through violence. One FBI agent characterized Harris as "went to kill," while Dylan wanted to die and didn't care if others died as well. This partnership, Harris the driving force, paired with Dylan's shadowed withdrawal, formed a mechanic of catastrophic intent. Over 11 months, they stockpiled weapons and explosives, documenting scripts and letters that, when later uncovered, sealed a chilling narrative of cold planning and wounded despair. The investigation and legal aftermath brought scrutiny not just on the perpetrators, but on institutional failures and gaps in law enforcement response. Officers hesitated to enter the building, sparking the development of immediate action, rapid deployment (IAR) tactics designed for active shooter scenarios. Families of victims, the press, and school communities demanded accountability, and courtrooms examined whether institutions or individuals could have intercepted warning signals. The court battles over disclosure of evidence, like the basement tapes, added a legal procedural layer. The Colorado judiciary weighed whether those recordings were criminal justice records subject to public release or protected private property under confidentiality statutes. The outcome shaped public discourse on transparency versus privacy in violent crime documentation. Beyond courtroom drama, the societal repercussions unfurled over decades. Columbine became a pivot, a byword for school shootings. It spurred policies on school security, mental health awareness, and preventive interventions. The so-called Columbine effect traces a legacy across policymaking, policing tactics, and the disturbing rise of copycat attacks. Psychologists studying cases like Harris and Klebold stress the interplay of mental health signals, social environment, subcultural dynamics, and access to weapons. Bullying, media exposure, and extremist reinforcement may create fertile ground for violence, but none alone explain it fully. In public safety takeaways, 3 lessons stand clear. First, early behavioral warning signs, like disturbing journal entries or threats, must not be dismissed, but assessed seriously and channeled to supportive interventions. Second, law enforcement protocol improvements like IARD are critical to minimizing passive response during unfolding massacres. Third, the need for mental health infrastructure in schools and communities is paramount, so vulnerable teens don't spiral unchecked toward destruction. Through the anguish and confusion, Sue Klebold's interviews and her memoir, A Mother's Reckoning, provide a heart-wrenching window into parental helplessness and grief. She revealed in media interviews how her first thought was fear for her son, then horror, and later reflection on red flags she glimpsed too late. In this story, the human dimension is never overshadowed. A mother haunted, survivors rebuilding, law enforcement adapting, society grappling with how to prevent the next tragedy. The legal proceedings, psychological insights, investigative developments, and public safety lessons form a textured narrative that resonates and retains attention by offering more than shock. It invites viewers into real-time analysis, reflection, and enduring relevance. Case 3.
One of the men convicted of killing Cassie Jo Stoddard 5 years ago this month could soon be back on trial in Pocatello.
Corey Adamczyk and Brian Draper. In September 2006, Pocatello, Idaho, became the setting for a chilling thrill killing that would expose a disturbing intersection of adolescent psychology, horror film fandom, and a desperate craving for notoriety. On the night of September 22nd, 16-year-olds Brian Lee Draper and Tori Michael Adamczyk visited their classmate Cassie Jo Stoddard while she was babysitting at her aunt and uncle's house. Pretending to go to the movies, they returned masked, tampered with the fuse box to instill terror, then came upstairs and stabbed her repeatedly. She would later be found brutally murdered. Both teens were obsessed with horror movies and infamous school shootings. Draper idolized Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold of Columbine. Adamczyk drew inspiration from the Scream franchise. In videos they recorded, they even drafted a death list, rationalizing that Cassie had to be the one. A statement that chillingly reveals their thrill-seeking mindset. Investigators recovered a burned videotape from Black Rock Canyon. When restored, it confirmed their ominous plan was premeditated and documented for posterity. In it, the pair expressed a violent desire to replicate horror fiction in reality, and literally film themselves doing it. Police initially examined other suspects, Stoddard's mother's boyfriend and her boyfriend, Matt Beckham, but both were cleared. Interrogation of Draper and Adamczyk revealed inconsistencies. They claimed to have been at the theater, but couldn't recall details. Under pressure, Draper confessed, guided police to the evidence site, and incriminating tapes sealed their fate. Tried as adults, despite being juveniles, both were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Draper was convicted in April 2007, Adamczyk in June 2007. On August 31st, they were each sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus 30 to life on the conspiracy charge. Their appeals were denied repeatedly. Draper's conspiracy conviction was vacated due to improper jury instructions, but his murder verdict and life sentence stood. Adamczyk's appeals, including habeas corpus claims tied to juvenile sentencing precedents, were likewise denied, including by the Ninth Circuit in 2022. The trial wielded video evidence that was undeniable, personal recordings of plotting and execution, brought to life by chilling detail. The legal proceedings highlight the tension between juvenile offenders and adult punishments, and the justice system wrestling with evolving understandings of adolescent neuroscience, especially after Montgomery v. Louisiana, 2019, which calls into question mandatory life sentences for minors. This case makes clear how media, both real and fictional, can weave into vulnerable adolescent psyches. It underscores the importance of monitoring changes in youth behavior, fostering mental health awareness, and ensuring early intervention in seclusion, obsession, or morbid fascination signs. Schools and communities must recognize red flags long before tragedy strikes. The justice system's handling of this case also teaches us the importance of appropriate prosecutorial strategy, such as balancing punishment with the potential for rehabilitation, especially given brain development science, while holding perpetrators fully accountable. Nearly 2 decades later, both remain incarcerated. Draper has expressed remorse, saying, "I regret it every day of my life," and reflecting that as a teenager he felt like a nobody and that committing something big and bad would finally matter. Their case continues to serve as a sobering testament to the consequences of adolescent violence, unchecked psychological distress, and the need for community vigilance. Meanwhile, Cassie's memory endures through community initiatives like Pumpkins for Cassie, which helps local charities and fosters positive remembrance, an ongoing lesson in healing and resilience. Case 4.
Also new at 5, the woman who was the mastermind in the brutal murder of a 12-year-old girl in southern Indiana is out of prison tonight.
Shanda Sharer. In the chill of an Indiana winter night in January 1992, 12-year-old Shanda Sharer was pulled into a violent maelstrom born of adolescent jealousy and fragile identity. 4 teenage girls, Melinda Loveless, Lori Tackett, Hope Rippey, and Toni Lawrence, lured Shanda from her father's home under the pretense of seeing Amanda Herren, with whom Shanda was romantically involved. Driven by possessiveness and emotional instability, the group drove her into darkness, and what unfolded next would unravel their lives forever. Over multiple torturous hours at a remote spot known as Witch's Castle, Shanda was restrained, taunted, and violently assaulted in a disturbing display of peer-driven cruelty. The assault escalated until the girls believed she was dead. But when they heard her still breathing, the violence escalated once more. They drove her to a secluded field, wrapped her in a blanket, doused her in gasoline, and burned her alive while she was still alive. A couple of hunters discovered her remains the next morning. The investigative process unfolded quickly. That same evening, Toni Lawrence and Hope Rippey, accompanied by their families, went to the sheriff's office and gave full statements. Within 48 hours, law enforcement had all 4 teens in custody, swift action that highlighted the importance of decisive procedure in a high-stakes case. In the courtroom, the interplay of psychological profile and legal proceedings took center stage. All 4 were charged as adults. Evidence revealed histories of abuse, mental health struggles, and trauma. Lori Tackett had been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and had a record of self-harm and hallucinations. Melinda Loveless had endured profound familial abuse and abandonment. Lawyers presented these as mitigating circumstances during sentencing hearings, powerful legacies of trauma that shaped their path toward violence. As the proceedings progressed, plea agreements emerged as strategic legal tools, accepted by all 4 to avoid the death penalty. Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett received concurrent 60-year sentences. Hope Rippey was given 60 years with part suspended and later had her term reduced. Toni Lawrence, who cooperated early, received 20 years for criminal confinement. These sentencing outcomes invite a broader criminal justice discussion. Should juveniles ever face adult sentencing? How do we weigh the gravity of their crimes against the influence of adolescent psychology and trauma? This case remains a prominent reference point in conversations about juvenile justice, rehabilitation, and societal response to deeply disturbed youth violence. Years later, their release sparked community reflection. Tackett was released in 2018, Loveless in 2019, Rippey earlier, and Lawrence in 2000. Shanda's mother, Jack Vaught, channeled her grief into purposeful rehabilitation efforts, establishing a scholarship and even donating a dog for training in a prison-based program involving Loveless. Her journey from tragedy to restorative action stands as a powerful public safety and healing takeaway, that trauma can be met with compassion and reform. The story has found echoes in media and culture, featured in true crime literature like Cruel Sacrifice and Little Lost Angel, dramatized in episodes of Law & Order SVU and Cold Case, and interpreted in visual art and theatrical works that explore group dynamics and adolescent identity struggle. Each adaptation invites audiences into deeper reflection on how rejection, jealousy, and influence can distort teen psychology. Last, Jack's efforts toward rehabilitation and legacy offer a poignant model, empowering victims, families to channel grief into community healing, and even restorative gestures toward perpetrators when it fosters growth and safety. This tragic case, with its blend of psychological depth, investigation, legal strategy, and social reflection, stays with us because it's not just about brutality, it's about the human factors that drive it, and the pathways toward justice and healing. It invites audiences to engage, not only with the chilling narrative, but with the deeper questions. How do we prevent future tragedies? How do we support troubled youth? And how can justice blend consequences with compassion? Case 5, Brooklyn Thrill Killers. In the summer of 1954, Brooklyn became the stage for a chilling spree of senseless violence carried out not by hardened criminals, but by 4 suburban teenage boys. Jack Kozlow, 18, Melvin Mittman, 17, Robert Trachtenberg, 15, and Jerome Lieberman, 17, emerged from typical middle-class Jewish homes, yet embarked on a trail of terror. They assaulted girls, drenched a man in gasoline and set him alight, horsewhipped women, and ultimately killed 2 vagrants, beating Reinhold Ulrichsen to death and dragging Willard Mentor, after burning his feet, to the East River where he drowned. What made these crimes profoundly disturbing and headline-grabbing was their utter lack of motive beyond the exhilarating rush of violence. The media dubbed them the Brooklyn Thrill Killers, and a flurry of sensational coverage painted these youths as symbols of juvenile delinquency gone dangerously off-script. The investigation of this case revealed startling psychological undercurrents. Psychiatric expert Dr. Frederick Wortham, already infamous for his critique of comic books, conducted a psychological profile of Kozlow. Wortham suggested that Kozlow's obsession with violent, pornographic comics, particularly Knights of Horror, fueled sadistic fantasies and fed the frenzy of violence. Although Kozlow never explicitly confirmed reading that specific title, Wortham's assertion linked lurid media consumption with real-world aggression. In the legal proceedings, Kozlow and Mittman faced trial for felony murder because the victim had been kidnapped and died during their assault. A jury, struggling with the notion of premeditation, allowed life sentences instead of capital punishment. On retrial, both pled guilty to second-degree murder and received 10 to 20-year sentences, with credit for time served and parole eligibility in 1961. Lieberman was cleared for lack of evidence, and Trachtenberg testified for the prosecution and entered a reformatory. Public reaction was fierce. Headlines branded the boys Boy Hitler of Flatbush Avenue, while publications like Time and Life linked the crimes to moral decay and juvenile disobedience. The case amplified the broader discourse on juvenile delinquency, assimilation pressures on Jewish American youth, and the power of media panic to shape policies. This case carried lasting implications beyond criminal law. It ignited a moral panic around comic books. Knights of Horror was seized and banned, contributing to the creation of the Comics Code Authority in October 1954. Ultimately, the Supreme Court upheld the ban in Kingsley Books v. Brown, 1957. From this harrowing case, several public safety takeaways emerge. First, it underscores how parental oversight and community awareness can be key in detecting troubling behavior early. Second, the case reminds us that psychological profile and investigation must probe deeper than apparent thrill-seeking to address escalating aggression. Third, in legal proceedings, ensuring proper representation and weighing rehabilitation alongside sentencing reflects a balanced approach, especially for juveniles. Finally, the case warns against moral panics. Scapegoating media alone risks oversimplifying the roots of violence. The Brooklyn Thrill Killers case is more than a sensational crime story. It's a study in adolescent psychology, societal anxieties, and the interplay between media, law, and moral reform. Case 6.
To return to Rhode Island next month to argue his latest appeal. He's currently serving a 25-year criminal contempt sentence in Florida.
Craig Price. Craig Chandler Price emerged from Warwick, Rhode Island, not as an expected horror story, but under the guise of a typical suburban teen. By 13, though, that facade shattered when he committed his first brutal murder, infiltrating a neighbor's home and repeatedly stabbing 27-year-old Rebecca Spencer 58 times, according to official accounts. Observers described that moment as a convergence of adolescent impulsivity and profound psychological disturbance. 2 years later, at just 15, Price carried out a second act so savage that its very detail jolts the imagination. High on marijuana and LSD, he murdered his neighbors, Joan Heaton, her 10-year-old daughter Jennifer, and 7-year-old Melissa, with a ferocity that defied understanding. Stab wounds numbered in the dozens, and in Melissa's case, her skull was crushed with a stool. The force was such that knife handles shattered and blades remained lodged in the victims' bodies. When law enforcement confronted him, Price's calm confession shocked the community. There was no sign of remorse. In chilling clarity, he even reflected on early childhood episodes of racial abuse. Moments he said first gave him the desire to see someone die. These revelations hinted at deep psychological fissures, perhaps rage, cultural trauma, or psychopathy, though no definitive clinical diagnosis is publicly confirmed. Legally, Price's case became a flashpoint. At the time, Rhode Island law mandated that juvenile offenders be released and have their records sealed by age 21, no matter their crimes. His sentence followed that rule. He remained locked up only until turning 21, and records were sealed. The impending release sent shockwaves through the community. Citizens mobilized, forming Citizens Opposed to the Release of Craig Price, arguing that the brutality and psychological profile made him unsuitable for release. The public pressure prompted lawmakers to overhaul juvenile justice statutes so that severe crimes could lead to adult trial and longer confinement, but those changes couldn't be applied retroactively to his case. True to those fears, Price never walked free in 1994. Instead, while still behind bars, he defied court orders to undergo psychological evaluation, acts of criminal contempt that earned him extended sentences totaling decades more. Further infractions piled up: extortion threats against guards, assaults on inmates, and attempts to obstruct treatment. He was transferred to Florida and ultimately sentenced in 2019 to another 25 years after a prison stabbing. Underpinning this legal drama is a layered psychological puzzle. Court-appointed experts, one having led psychiatry at the National Institute of Mental Health, another a forensic director, were tapped to diagnose and treat Price, hoping that intensive intervention might someday allow rehabilitation and community reentry. Yet, Price's refusal to engage, his deception during interviews, and history of institutional violence illustrated a grim picture: a juvenile offender deeply resistant to rehabilitation. What does Craig Price's story tell us about justice, youth, and public safety? It illustrates how justice systems may struggle with juvenile offenders who commit violent crimes. It underscores the importance of balancing rehabilitation goals with limitations in the juvenile justice structure. Price prompted crucial legal reform, showing that even one case can reshape how society treats young offenders. The narrative also offers a clear public safety lesson. Early behavioral intervention, robust psychological evaluation, and adaptable juvenile laws are essential for protecting communities. Ultimately, this case reminds us that the mind, even a young one, can harbor profound darkness, challenging assumptions about adolescence, accountability, and redemption. It warns that when legal systems fail to adapt, public safety can hang in the balance. Yet it also affirms that activist voices and impartial legal process can spark change. Case 7.
Kip, what do you want to tell your sister?
Kipland Kinkle. Kipland Kinkle was just 15 when tragedy unfolded in late May 1998. What began as a disciplinary issue, a suspension for possession of a stolen handgun in his locker, spiraled into something far darker. The day after that suspension, Kip fatally shot his parents at home. The following morning, tormented by disturbing command hallucinations, he carried multiple weapons into Thurston High School in Springfield, Oregon. He entered the cafeteria and fired indiscriminately, killing 2 classmates and injuring more than 24 others. His actions ended only when fellow students tackled him while he was reloading. He later told investigators he had wanted someone else to shoot him, to end what he described as unbearable inner voices. Eventually, he pleaded guilty to both murder and attempted murder, receiving a cumulative sentence of approximately 111 years without parole. What makes this case so compelling and chilling is not only the violence, but the psychological descent of a teenager whose unseen struggle went largely unaddressed. Kip's fascination with guns, explosives, and shock rock music was well known to his peers. He openly spoke of wanting to join the military to see what it was like to kill, and even gave a class presentation on bomb making. Teachers considered him strange, morbid, even psychotic, yet the depth of his mental health crisis remained hidden. Kip's parents, caring but concerned, enrolled him in therapy. Over 6 months, the psychologist diagnosed him with major depressive disorder and prescribed Prozac. Reports suggest that sessions ceased after things seemed to improve, and shortly after, Kip stopped taking his medication. Beneath the surface, however, the illness deepened. Kip began experiencing terrifying auditory hallucinations, command voices he called Voice A, B, and C. One told him to kill, another repeated insults, the third echoed both. He believed the government had implanted a chip in his brain, or that Disney was taking over the world with its own currency. Stress amplified the voices, and he never confided in anyone, fearing stigma, rejection, or being institutionalized. In his later reflections, Kip would say he had no other choice, with the voices driving him relentlessly. During interrogation, he pleaded with police, "Shoot me, kill me." He'd said he wanted to provoke a lethal response, an anguished desire to escape the madness inside. The legal journey that followed became as much about psychology as punishment. The defense introduced expert testimony that Kip suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, an illness that, with treatment, could be managed. One expert argued that if Kip remained on medication and under psychiatric care, he might one day reintegrate safely into society. Yet the plea deal ultimately avoided an insanity defense. Instead, Kip pleaded guilty, sacrificing any chance of acquittal by reason of insanity, and was sentenced at sentencing hearings that lasted multiple days, with survivors, families, and experts in attendance. He received concurrent 25-year terms for murder, plus additional sentences for attempted murder, all stacking to more than a century. That sentencing hearing is crucial to highlight. Judge Madison weighed not only the gravity of the crimes, but Kip's youth, his mental health, and the painful testimony of survivors like Jacob Riker, shot in the chest yet still wrestling Kip to the ground, and Tony Case, whose injuries left him permanently affected. Those courtroom moments, heavy with both grief and complex empathy, create psychological tension and human stakes that hold attention. Beyond individual tragedy, the case raises broader reflections about criminal justice, mental health systems, and school safety. Kip's undiagnosed or undertreated schizophrenia and depression highlight how behavioral red flags can escalate when interventions stop prematurely. Schools and communities can learn from this. Earlier, sustained mental health support and clearer protocols for students expressing violent ideation might help prevent the worst outcomes. The tragedy underscores the complexity of balancing rehabilitation with accountability, particularly when youth and illness collide. Today, Kinkle remains incarcerated. He receives mental health treatment, works as an electrician, and has pursued education behind bars. His sister Kristen, the lone surviving family member, visits regularly. Her story deepens the narrative of trauma, grief, and loyalty. She speaks candidly about her brother as someone consumed by illness, not pure evil, complicated by loss and the wounds that ripple outward. This unsettling case serves as a cautionary exploration of how young minds can fracture under untreated mental illness, and how justice systems must grapple with punishment, public safety, and the possibility of rehabilitation. As we examine Kip Kinkle's story, its psychological depth, courtroom drama, and lasting impact, there is a call to listen more deeply, intervene sooner, and build systems that protect both individuals in crisis and the communities around them. Case 8.
It's been more than a decade since Morgantown native Skyler Neese was killed by her two friends, Rachel Schoaf and Sheila Eddy. And now Skyler's father is speaking out ahead of Schoaf's parole hearing scheduled for next week.
Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf. On a quiet summer night in West Virginia, a promising 16-year-old honor student named Skyler Neese vanished without a trace. Surveillance footage captured a figure slipping out of her window and into a car around 12:30 a.m. on July 6, 2012. The person behind the wheel? A best friend, Sheila Eddy. Alongside her was Rachel Schoaf. Two faces of teenage trust soon revealed as instruments of betrayal. What unfolded would become one of the most chilling investigations in modern juvenile crime history. At first, the story seemed tragic but familiar. A runaway, whispered rumors, a community in anguish. Law enforcement launched a search. The FBI joined the hunt. Friends fanned out missing person flyers, and online conversations buzzed with worry. Sheila herself comforted Skyler's parents, holding their hands and helping distribute flyers, all the while suppressing the secret that she and Rachel had driven her friend into darkness. But beneath that facade lay a twisted psychological landscape. The investigation uncovered a growing tension within the trio, an emotional disconnect that had been simmering silently. Unearthed tweets from Skyler spoke of betrayal and fractured trust. "You doing like that is why I can never completely trust you." The bonds of friendship had become brittle, and jealousy and insecurity festered in private. The crime itself was brutal in its finality, yet shocking in its simplicity. On that night, the three girls drove across state lines to a wooded area in Pennsylvania, seemingly to smoke marijuana, but in reality, Sheila and Rachel had concealed kitchen knives, taped to their torsos, wrapped in towels, hidden beneath their arms. At a signal of 3, they attacked. Skyler ran, but Rachel tackled her, and Sheila joined in, stabbing her repeatedly. Skyler fought back, even wounding Rachel above the ankle before succumbing. The body could not be buried in rocky soil. Instead, it was obscured with branches, leaves, and dirt. The ensuing investigation took months. An initial Amber Alert was not triggered. Authorities assumed Skyler was a runaway. As inconsistencies surfaced in Sheila and Rachel's story, suspicion mounted. A lie detector test failed, CCTV footage contradicted their timeline, and cell phone records placed them far from home. Under pressure, Rachel suffered a mental breakdown in December 2012 and was hospitalized. Released in January 2013, she confessed in a controlled setting, led investigators to the crime scene, marking a turning point in the investigation. In the courtroom, legal proceedings unfolded with gripping intensity. Rachel, in plea negotiations, accepted responsibility. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder on May 1, 2013, and in exchange for her cooperation, leading police to the body, received a 30-year sentence with eligibility for parole after 10 years. Sheila, facing more severe charges, eventually pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in January 2014, securing a life sentence with mercy and parole eligibility after 15 years. Trial testimony and sentencing hearings were emotionally charged. Rachel expressed remorse, saying that the person responsible was not the real me, and offering an apology to Skyler's family. Sheila, by contrast, never publicly showed that same remorse. In court, her plea came amid a wave of media coverage, the courtroom drama capturing headlines and capturing public attention. This case prompted a broader legal and social reckoning. Nearly a year after Skyler's disappearance, West Virginia revised its missing child protocol, expanding Amber Alert criteria to prevent such delays in the future. It underscored how tragedy can catalyze legal reform and public policy shifts. Years later, both remain incarcerated at Lakin Correctional Center. Rachel was denied parole during hearings in May 2023 and again in July 2024. Her projected release date remains April 30, 2028. Sheila's first parole hearing is also set for 2028. The case endures in media, featured in a Dateline episode Something Wicked, a 2020 special, and the podcast 3, continuing to draw attention to teenage betrayal and psychological collapse. This psychological profile of two teens who unearthed a horrifying impulse captures why the story resonates. It's not just the cruelty of the act, but the dissonance of friendship turned lethal. It raises complex questions about adolescent identity, peer pressure, and what drives young minds to commit irreversibly evil choices. Contemporary viewers and future analysts are drawn in by these questions. Can someone you trust become a predator? What vulnerabilities lurk beneath smiles and social media posts? In terms of public safety takeaways, the case underscores the importance of reporting concerning behavior among youth. Skyler's parents later launched Skyler Talks, visiting schools to promote Skyler's promise, encouraging young people to speak up if something feels wrong. They hope to deter future tragedies by fostering communities of accountability and empathy. Through the lens of rehabilitation, the sentences reflect justice balanced with the possibility of transformation. Rachel's remorse, her breakdown, and her cooperation illustrate a complex arc of culpability, accountability, and potential redemption. While her parole has so far been denied, her reflections and remorse continue to be weighed by authorities. Sheila, in contrast, never offered those internal signs of rehabilitation, highlighting how different profiles within co-perpetrators affect how justice is administered. Case 9. Aidan Fucci, James Campbell, Barry Lukatis, Eric Smith. On a quiet Mother's Day morning in May 2021, investigators launched a meticulous investigation into the disappearance of 13-year-old Tristan Bailey in St. Johns County, Florida. Surveillance footage captured Tristan walking into the woods with her 14-year-old schoolmate, Aidan Fucci. Less than 2 hours later, the same footage showed him returning alone, shoes in hand. Forensic investigators recovered a knife fragment embedded in Tristan's scalp and traced it to a blade belonging to Fucci, while bloodied clothes and wet shoes in his home added further clarity to the case. The ensuing investigation became a psychological profile of a young offender. Friends revealed that Fucci had spoken about fantasies of killing, even planning to drag someone into the woods. These chilling details informed the legal proceedings. Originally charged with second-degree murder, his charge was upgraded to premeditated first-degree murder. In February 2023, just as jury selection was to begin, Fucci entered a guilty plea. At the sentencing hearing in March, the judge, calling it the most difficult and shocking case he had presided over, imposed life imprisonment with eligibility for case review after 25 years. This case underscores how early warning signs, fantasies expressed, ominous drawings, behavior in confinement, played a pivotal role in the investigation and courtroom drama. It also highlights the importance of multidisciplinary assessment in juvenile justice and the challenges in balancing accountability, public safety, and rehabilitation. A few decades earlier, in February 1996, law enforcement responded to a harrowing scene at Frontier Middle School in Moses Lake, Washington. 14-year-old Barry Lukatis, dressed as a Wild West gunslinger, opened fire in his algebra classroom with his father's firearms, killing his teacher and 2 classmates before taking hostages. The crisis was diffused when a gym coach wrestled the rifle away and subdued him. The intensity of the active shooter response, coordination with emergency services, and negotiation tactics became textbook examples in law enforcement training. During the trial, psychologists diagnosed Lukatis with dysthymic disorder, noting a multi-generational history of depression. Defense experts emphasized his mental illness, Prosecution portrayed Lucatus as inspired by violent media. Rental records showed repeated viewings of natural-born killers, and references to Stephen King's Rage and the video for Jeremy surfaced during testimony. The trial testimony revealed how media, mental health, and adolescent vulnerability converged. Lucatus was convicted on multiple counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, attempted murder, and sentenced to 2 life terms plus 205 years. After U.S. Supreme Court rulings on juvenile life without parole, he was resentenced in 2017 to 189 years, with an emotional apology letter marking a rare moment of self-reflection. This episode illustrates how the criminal justice system grapples with the tension between punishment and hope for rehabilitation, especially amid mental health concerns. In August 1993, in rural New York, investigators confronted an unthinkable tragedy. 4-year-old Derek Roby was found dead in a wooded area near his home. The unexpected suspect was Eric M. Smith, then 13. He confessed after initially denying involvement. Psychological evaluations revealed he suffered from intermittent explosive disorder, ADHD, and depression, and had endured relentless bullying at school because of his appearance. Yet no clear motive emerged. His psychological profile became central to both prosecution and defense. Smith was tried as an adult, convicted of second-degree murder in 1994, and sentenced to 9 years to life, the maximum then allowed for juveniles. The sentencing hearing was followed by multiple parole hearings over nearly 3 decades. In October 2021, after 27 years of incarceration and participation in therapy, he was granted parole and released in February 2022. His release ignited debates about public safety, rehabilitation, and whether his transformation marked a system success or failure. This case serves as a vivid study in how rehabilitation efforts, structured risk assessment, and community dialogue inform parole decisions in juvenile-perpetrated crimes. More recently, in August 2024, and very far from rural New York, law enforcement in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, responded to another youthful tragedy. At a sleepover, 13-year-old James C. Campbell allegedly stabbed his cousin, 10-year-old Hunter Myers, while he slept. Responding officers found the victim deceased, a knife nearby, and Campbell with blood on his clothes and lacerations on his hand. He confessed at the scene and was charged as an adult with first-degree murder. A preliminary hearing was scheduled, and investigators noted motive remained unknown. From the investigation's first moments through arraignment, this case demonstrates how swift law enforcement action, forensic attention, and procedural precision form the backbone of the criminal justice process, even amid shocking circumstances. The family's public plea for compassion also underscores the complex emotional terrain that justice systems must navigate. Case 10. Shawn Sellers. Shawn Sellers was born on May 18, 1969, in California to a young, troubled household, and by his early teens had endured frequent moves, emotional instability, and abuse at home. As a child, he began hearing voices around ages 6 or 7, which grew more disturbing over time, voices that he at first thought were normal. His exposure to occult ideas began in his pre-adolescence, fueled by influences like satanic texts introduced by caregivers, and he became immersed in demonology and ritual practices, even storing blood in vials and drinking it at school. At age 16, Sellers committed his first murder, the shooting death of a convenience store clerk, Robert Paul Bauer, after stating he wanted to experience killing someone. 6 months later, in March 1986, Sellers returned home, found a gun, and shot his stepfather and mother as they slept, wearing only underwear, an eerie attempt to avoid blood evidence, before trying to stage the scene as an intruder attack. The investigation began quickly. His friend, Richard Howard, initially implicated, testified that Sellers declared he had killed, leading authorities to apprehend and charge Sellers. In legal proceedings, Sellers' defense presented a psychological profile focused on demonic possession, satanic influence, and dissociation. His attorneys claimed he was legally unconscious, unable to form intent. They also attempted to argue that Dungeons & Dragons had disconnected him from reality, though Sellers later disavowed that claim. The jury ultimately rejected these defenses and convicted him of 3 counts of first-degree murder, sentencing him to death. At the time, Oklahoma did not permit life sentences without parole. As appeals unfolded, Sellers raised the possibility of multiple personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder, and a childhood brain injury. Appellate judges acknowledged clinical evidence indicating he may have committed the crimes in an unrecognized alter personality, but ruled these issues were procedurally barred on appeal, urging clemency as the avenue for consideration. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the EU, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and the American Bar Association all criticized the decision, emphasizing that executing a person for crimes committed under 18, especially with mental health concerns, contradicts modern principles of justice. Sellers remained the only person in the U.S. executed for a crime committed under age 17 after capital punishment was reinstated in 1976. He was executed by lethal injection on February 4, 1999. During his time on death row, Sellers underwent a spiritual transformation, converting to Christianity, marrying briefly, writing and publishing works including Web of Darkness and a book of poems, mentoring other inmates, and speaking publicly about cults, Satanism, and redemption, demonstrating real potential for rehabilitation. In one striking act, he defended another prisoner from an attack, illustrating his transformation from violence to compassion. The sentencing hearing and subsequent appeals reflect a harsh lesson in criminal justice reform, that developmental neuroscience now confirms adolescents are not the same as adults in capacity for impulse control and moral reasoning. Jurors were not allowed to hear expert testimony on juvenile brain development, expert testimony that today would likely be considered mitigating in capital cases. From Sellers' story, several public safety and policy lessons emerge. Youth mental health support, early intervention in trauma and dissociation, and robust legal safeguards for juveniles are all critical. The notion that youth offenders may be rehabilitated, especially when mental illness is at play, became enshrined by the Supreme Court in Roper v. Simmons, 2005, which deemed executing individuals for crimes committed under 18 unconstitutional, a direct challenge to Oklahoma's actions in Sellers' case. Case 11, James Farweather and William Herrens. In the spring of 2014, in the quiet city of Colchester, Essex, a chilling investigation began that would unravel the psyche of a teenage offender and shatter the community's sense of safety. 15-year-old James Farweather, a struggling schoolboy grappling with dyslexia, childhood loss, and relentless bullying, began to act out a tragic psychological profile that expert analysis would later highlight. Despite an early sentence for knife-point robbery in January 2014, nothing seemed to stop the downward spiral. On the 29th of March 2014, the body of 33-year-old James Atfield, physically vulnerable due to a brain injury, was discovered in Castle Park. The sheer brutality, over 100 stab wounds, hard for police even to describe, set off alarm bells. 3 months later, on the 17th of June, Nahid Al-Manea, a 31-year-old Saudi student, was found bludgeoned and killed in a wooded trail. The violence bore haunting symbolism. Al-Manea's eyes had been targeted to prevent her seeing evil. As the investigation deepened, detectives initially feared a hate crime, but the emerging psychological profile hinted at something darker: random victims selected by voices in the mind. A year passed before law enforcement connected the dots. In May 2015, a vigilant dog walker spotted Farweather loitering with a knife and rubber-gripped gloves. The investigation pivoted, revealing that he'd been researching serial killer documentaries and admitting to psychiatrists some of the most antisocial and violent thoughts they had ever heard. During legal proceedings, he claimed psychosis. The jury, however, rejected that defense. At his sentencing hearing in April 2016, Farweather was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 27 years. an outcome born of both brutal facts and the legal conclusion that he was fully responsible for his actions. Turning back the clock to the mid-1940s, a different American psychological drama was unfolding, with its own complex web of interrogation, confession, and claims of innocence. William George Herrens, later dubbed the Lipstick Killer, was a gifted student whose early life was shaped by poverty and family instability. Arrested in June 1946 for a burglary, he soon became linked to 3 savage murders, including that of 6-year-old Suzanne Degnan, after a message, scrawled in lipstick, was found at the crime scene. The investigation was dramatic and controversial. Herrens endured 6 days of unrelenting interrogation, reportedly without access to his lawyer or parents. Under sodium pentothal, a so-called truth serum administered without consent, he spoke of an alternate personality named George Merman, supposedly responsible for the crimes. The media transformed the name into Murder Man. Handwriting and fingerprint evidence tying him to crime scenes were challenged due to chain of custody issues and scientific uncertainty, and a viable alternative suspect reportedly existed. Yet, under enormous pressure, Herrens entered guilty pleas, avoiding trial in exchange for life sentences. His trial testimony was minimal. He stated later that, "I confessed to save my life." Herrens' subsequent decades in prison became defined by rehabilitation. He earned a college degree, the first inmate in Illinois to do so, taught fellow prisoners, and became a legal advisor inside the system. Multiple clemency and parole efforts were mounted in light of concerns over coercion and false confession, but each appeal, including a brief 1983 court ruling deeming his sentence cruel, was ultimately overturned by political and public resistance. These 2 cases, though separated by decades and geography, intersect on themes that fuse psychology with criminal justice. James Farweather's actions were filtered through psychosis denial, random and symbolic violence, and the community's need to understand a young mind gone dark. William Herrens' saga, meanwhile, sits at the crossroads of questioning interrogation techniques, the reliability of confession, and the pursuit of redemption through education and legal advocacy. If these stories made you think twice, if they gripped you, shocked you, or left you craving to know what lies beneath the surface, hit that subscribe button now and join the Mindframe True Crimes family. Every week, we dive deeper into the hidden corridors of the human mind, unraveling the truths behind the headlines and the secrets even courtrooms can't fully reveal. And to all my loyal subscribers and returning viewers, thank you for keeping your mind in the frame. You're the reason we can keep shining a light into the world's darkest corners. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, the mind is the most dangerous place of all. This is Mindframe True Crimes. Until next time.